Welcome to another episode of the Group Dynamic Podcast. My name is Jürgen and I will be your host in the next 60 minutes, in which I'm going to talk with Robert Wallace. And Robert is a very seasoned professional with a lot of experience in change management, and he's also a member of the National Training Laboratories, the NTL. And I'm going to talk with Robert about the NTL HI Lab, the Human Interaction Laboratory, which is a very interesting concept. And we are going to explain what it is all about and what you might learn. And you can be sure that
you are certainly having an experience that will change you.
So I'm now wishing a lot of fun and interesting thoughts. And maybe afterwards you are considering taking an HI Lab yourself. All right, Bob, it's great to have you for this episode of the podcast talking about the HI Lab, the NTL HI Lab. And I think I had the pleasure to experience one myself during the TTTG program, the facilitators training for the HI Lab. I don't get the abbreviation right at the moment. But for me, it was a very interesting experience. And I would love to talk with you a little bit about how it is and probably see how it is compared to other formats and what can people learn in the HI Lab. And since you are a facilitator and I had the pleasure to experience you myself, it's really wonderful to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jürgen. It's so good to be on with you. And thank you for the invitation. And for your listeners, the TTTG stands for Transforming Through T Groups.
Yes. A fantastic program, by the way, but that would be another topic. And I remember when I arrived at the National Conference Center in Washington, and the building itself might be another podcast episode because it's quite unique.
Yeah.
I remember that I was asked to create my own name tag. So I was drawing and trying to wrap my head around, okay, who am I? That was a very interesting experience for me. And I drew a lobster on it, showing that I have a very hard shell and that it is soft from the inside, which was something that came up through the week. But maybe for those who are listening, if we talk about an HI Lab, people are probably familiar with a T group, with a training group. What is an HI Lab?
HI Lab is a training experience or experience-based training. Participants work together in small groups, and their learning comes through analysis of personal experiences, feelings, reactions, perceptions, and the behavior of other people in the lab.
That sounds like you analyze what is happening in the moment you are in the lab. But it's not a lab. It's not like people are running around in white coats and...
No. The term lab or laboratory comes from people sharing their experiences, evaluating their experiences, taking some risk, really analyzing how their behavior impacts other people. And people get that through feedback. And there are also structures that we have to guide people in terms of making the best use of their time in the lab.
And when I arrived, I think the setup was like a circle of chairs. And I remember that is a reoccurring experience, that I'm sitting in a circle of chairs with people I don't know and then talk about what's happening. And that happened at the TTTG as well. And is this the general setup for any HI lab, so that we're in a circle of chairs with how many people?
There would generally be anywhere from 10 to 14 people. That's an optimal small group. People will sit in chairs in a circle without tables, because tables represent barriers. People can hide behind tables and things that they would put on tables. And it's an opportunity for people to all see each other in a circle and basically to build a relationship from that format.
And I think it is important, at least for me, it was important to see how the others behave in terms of how do they sit, how do they breathe, probably to ask for feedback, to really try to analyze these weak signals that are happening in the group?
That's a key point. There are often visual signals. If you were to see someone crying in a group, or if someone were in distress, that would be very visible to you during the lab. And there is a leadership vacuum, if you will, that exists in a T group. The leadership emerges from the participants. The facilitators are there to provide emotional and psychological safety and intervene whenever it's needed to guide the group. But it's very much different from, say, a lecture where you go in, you sit down, and you have a person that's in charge and they set the agenda for the day.
Yeah, and that's probably the experience part in it. So you experience what you are learning and you are not being told what you're learning in the moment.
That is correct. Yeah. That is absolutely correct. And we encourage people to keep journals of what is going on, what their experience is like, what their feelings were, and to really use that to document their experience so that they can review that maybe in the evening, maybe a week later, maybe even months later, because things are happening or internalizing an experience. And it's good to take notes as memory joggers for what was happening, as well as to recall your feelings, rather than to try to memorize everything that happened during the T group.
I remember the feeling aspect, and that this was quite something that you stressed during the lab. And I found that confusing because I never experienced such a strong focus on feelings. Why is that such a relevant aspect in the lab?
Feelings are genuine and real for people. There is a cross-section of people that come to the lab, and oftentimes people are accomplished, they're performance-driven, they want to be measured by their performance, and are often very intellectual and in their head about how they perform, how they show up, how they think they will be measured. Feelings are personal. Everyone has feelings about any given thing. And as we get in touch with our feelings, those are signals, those are messages that come from within our body that will help us to come to grips with what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, whether it's between us and someone else, or if we are observing, let's say two other people have an interaction, feelings come up. An example of that would be if there were a man that was, let's say, 6 feet, 4 inches tall and weighed 250 pounds.
So that's big in metric terms. I think 6 feet is quite huge.
It's a large person.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I don't know the metric system.
Yeah, but large person. Yeah.
A large person. And let's say there was a woman that was short in stature, say 5 feet, or let's say, 5 feet. Let's say she was 5 feet tall and slight in weight. If they were to get into a heated argument as an observer, I'm looking at the dynamics that are going on between two people who are mismatched physically in size. I'm also looking at the gender dynamics. There's a man and a woman. And so based on my life experience, I have certain feelings about that. Do I want to protect her? Do I want to restrain him? And those are experiences that I'm observing. I'm not in it, but I have a reaction to that. There are things going on in my body as well as thoughts. So I have feelings as well as thoughts. And I would want to really take note of that and figure out, well, what's going on? Why do I feel this way? and how would I react
Mm-hmm.
to what I'm seeing.
And if you say I, you mean yourself in the role of a participant. If you are a participant in the group and observe two other members of the group doing that or being in that situation.
That is correct.
And what would I do? So if I'm sitting in the circle of chairs, would I, let's say, if I want to protect the woman, would I voice that? Would I say that in the group? Or what am I going to do with that? Because for me, it's first, I think the first hurdle for me would be to realize this emotion, to realize what's going on, which needs a lot of introspection from my side. And then if I have it, what am I going to do with it?
That is a critical amount of processing, and that may happen quickly for you.
Mm-hmm.
For other people, they may need to sit with that for a while before they say anything. So a lot of that is dependent on your personality type.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a person that wants to come in and, quote, rescue the woman, you may say something to the man.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much a physical interaction, but you might get his attention by talking about how you're feeling about his interaction with her.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way of inserting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If your nature is to really analyze and try to figure out what's going on, you may not say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a range that really depends on who the people are, what your personality type is, how invested you are in what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a key point, because that represents what we call the here and now experience. It's something that happened in the moment that everyone in the group can see, and they have a reaction to that. They have a perception of what's going on. And that's the richest way of really growing, if you will, in terms of what just happened. I would contrast that to one person sitting and telling a story about a conflict that they have with their boss back at work. And that tends not to engage people because there's only one point of view that's being presented. And all you can do is sort of offer people advice. And people can do that in a bar.
Yeah. And that's the there and then compared to the here and now that would be important in the lab.
That is correct. That is correct.
And is it called a lab? Because I was wondering if I would be able to run, so to speak, experiments with my behavior. So if I would protect the woman, if we stay with this example, by engaging with the man, and that would be like a typical behavior that I would show, would the HI Lab be a place to run an experiment and do something different this time and to see how it plays out?
Absolutely. That is the place to experiment on your behavior. You know how you would normally react if your inclination is to engage with the man to save the woman. Maybe your behavior might be to sit back for a while and see what happens. If your normal inclination is to sit back, maybe you would try the behavior of intervening and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm feeling uncomfortable about what I'm seeing and hearing right now. And to the man, I think you need to just sort of back up because I'm uncomfortable. I can't speak to how the woman is feeling, but that's an example of it being called a laboratory. You experiment with different behaviors. The other thing is that there are norms or agreements that we have up front, and one of which is confidentiality. And so we talk about that, and the point is that people would not share other people's experiences and their words, and that allows people to be more genuine. Certainly talk about what you learned from your experience there, but understand that if you're talking about someone else, the context is not there. So you can own your experience and talk to someone who was not there about your experience, but not just sort of reveal what happens with other people.
The other thing that I found extremely helpful besides the confidentiality was that there were only strangers in the group, so no one I knew before. And that made it easier for me to open up in a way.
Yes. And at NTL, we put a conscious effort into ensuring that there are stranger group. The entire makeup of the group is people who are strangers. And that comes from their application, where they work, physically, what part of a country they're from. If people are from the United States, do you work together or anything like that? And we also are very overt about that once we get together to find out, are there people here that know each other or have a relationship with each other? And we manage that. We want to make that visible so that people can feel free to express themselves without any fear of retribution, say, through the workplace.
Yeah. And getting back to the lab idea and experimenting with my behavior to figure out how I react, for me, that took a tremendous amount of learning how to reflect. And there is one example that really has impressed me, and that was, I often said, I'm confused as an emotion. And someone else, I think in the lab, said, no, confusion is not an emotion. Confusion often covers up another emotion. So it's just a layer that you have to peel off. And I found that very interesting because, at least for me, it was true that when I'm confused, sometimes there is another emotion underneath it. And maybe I don't want to talk about that emotion at that moment. And the HI Lab is running for a week, I think.
Yes.
Is that enough to get into such a reflective mode?
We found that to be effective. If you look back at the history of NTL, which has been in existence for 74 years, at one time, labs were 3 weeks long.
Wow.
3 weeks. And then after review, they were cut back to 2 weeks. And currently we are at 1 week. At one point, we even went to 4 days.
Okay.
And just found out that that was too short a time.
Okay.
And what happens over a week is that you have strangers come in, and think about it as 10 to 14 individuals that walk into a room. Hopefully by the end of the week, they walk out as a unified group.
Yeah.
And that comes from their interactions, their sharing, their receiving feedback about their behavior, and an understanding of why people perceive them in a certain way. And so that tends to be optimal. The labs will start generally on a Sunday afternoon and end by noon on Friday.
Okay.
It's also residential, and we have sessions in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening.
Yeah. I was wondering, like you said, they're coming in as individuals and they walk out as a unified team. And I thought, wow, this would be so amazing to have this in the corporate world, to put everyone into a lab and then they will be unified teams. But that's not possible because of the stranger principle. That wouldn't be possible in the corporate world, would it?
Well, it would be modified in the corporate world because of the team building aspect of it.
Yeah.
We would customize the design to work with intact groups.
Okay.
So there are organizations that say, bring your principles to our company. Here is a set group of people that we want to understand the objectives of a human interaction lab, which would be communication, it would be emotional intelligence, it would be self-awareness, group dynamics, conflict resolution. Those are elements that are important in any corporate environment.
That's interesting. I would like to come back to that because that reminds me about the community learning sessions a little bit, contrasting to the T groups. Another thought that just crossed my mind was the 4 or 5 days. So after 4 days, there seems to be a threshold. Something is happening there. And the same is, I heard the same from other people who are doing sensitivity groups or other formats of training groups. Would it be possible to say what is happening after 4 days? What is this watershed that people have to cross somehow?
I would say that a level of trust is built up. There's a sense of safety. There is trust in the facilitators to guide the people through the experience. And just think about individuals coming in from different parts of the world, not knowing each other and not knowing who's in the room and how does that change over time. And so there are different activities that are done. A community learning session really is like a lecture, if you can think about it that way, where theory is presented. Then the T group is an opportunity for people to practice some of the theory that they've learned. So again, this is the laboratory aspect, that you have an as-is state in terms of coming in, and then you're progressing and changing because you are experimenting with different behaviors. You also have some goals, some learning goals. So that's also a guiding principle for you.
I remember the learning goals, and I really like to draft them because I remember we drafted them on large sheets of paper and then put them to the wall. And I found it extremely interesting while sitting in the circle in the T group, looking at my learning goals and figuring out, okay, what I'm doing right now, is it supporting my learning goals or is it harming my learning goals? And also being reminded about my learning goals. If someone would say, hey, what you're doing right now, is this really in accordance with your learning goals? That struck me a couple of times.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to your learning goals and being present, we establish learning partners where people have an opportunity to work together. So as your learning goals are posted, you have a person that you may, let's say, have a buddy relationship with, and you agree on, well, how do I like to receive feedback? Be kind and gentle, or just give it to me right between my eyes. So that's where people can talk about how they like to learn. And with the learning goals being posted on the walls, everyone can see them. And that's an opportunity to say, are you moving toward your goals or are you not? Your behavior doesn't seem like you're doing anything to move towards your goals. So let's pick up the pace because we know that come Friday at noon, we're going to be done. So this is what leads people to a watershed, as you said.
Okay. So is it pressure a little bit, like I have to do it because if the whole thing ends, it's like an opportunity that's wasted?
There are some people that do not listen to the facilitators. And having been through the experience as a facilitator, we know what will accelerate your learning and what represents a wasted opportunity. So we will encourage people sometimes publicly in the group and sometimes with just private counseling to encourage people to move forward or ask them why they haven't invested themselves more. So it becomes obvious about who's doing the work to move toward their goals and investing themselves in the theory versus someone that's just sitting there because they were ordered to go to the lab.
And I remember that every time we changed our learning goals, we had to tell the group. At first, I found it interesting that I changed my learning goals indeed. So they, for whatever reason, they transformed over the time, and that we had to communicate that. What is the reason for that?
It makes you accountable to others. if you were to just sort of change it, I wouldn't know if that was your change or if someone came in during a break and wrote over your goal. So the very fact that you can own it and say, I have a different perspective now and I want to tweak or modify my goal or just change it altogether, you're being public to the community. And again, people can then hold you accountable to moving toward that new goal.
So if I try to wrap it up a little bit, the HI Lab has 3 elements as far as I would say. It's the T group that is part of the lab, where we are sitting in a circle of chairs for about 90 minutes each and talk about what is happening and what's coming up for me while things are happening, so that I can run experiments with my behavior. The second element are the community learning sessions that are like lectures. And there are certain topics that you mentioned, like conflict management, group dynamics, communication. That's one that I remember. And I would like to get to diversity in a couple of minutes. And the idea behind the learning sessions is that I try to apply what I have learned in the next T group, basically.
That is correct, as well as you understand the theory. And also during the community learning sessions, there are discussions and group activities. So yes, it's similar to a lecture, but before we disband, it's an opportunity for you to ask questions. And also we would engage, because adult learning is really more effective when people are engaged in activities where they can see there are different types of learning. So there are people that can listen. There are people that can read or are visual learners. And then there are people that are kinesthetic learners. They need to put their hands on something and get involved. And all of those are different learning styles for people. And we try to incorporate that in the lab as well.
And that was, for me, a very interesting experience, these community learning sessions, because I usually would say I thought I know a lot of the theory that's behind that. But the way it was presented, and especially how we worked with it in the community learning session, that was entirely new for me. And I found that very intense in a way. And the third element, the learning partner, basically helps like a buddy to understand and to have, for me, I would say it was like an anchor in this turbulent week, so to speak. So that was some like a trustee, a person for me that was quite helpful.
Yes.
And the topics of the community learning sessions, you mentioned a couple of them. Is there a sequence of the topics, and what is the concept behind that?
Well, self-disclosure and feedback are the first topics that we present. And this gives the participants a structure to really do meaningful work. If there are things that are going on inside of you, I wouldn't know that unless you disclose that to me or to the group. Whatever you share or however you share it will land on me in a certain way. And if I appreciate the way you express yourself impacted me, I would give you feedback. If I felt some discomfort or pain from that, I would give you feedback. So that's a foundation. Journaling is encouraged. And the topics are sequenced based on how the group is developing.
And is it, I mean, there are certain frameworks of how groups are developing, and more or less they seem to develop in a similar way. So the topics are always the same, or do you make small adjustments once in a while?
It depends on what the group needs. There's public information about the outcomes of human interaction labs. So people are coming knowing that there are topics like emotional intelligence or diversity or group dynamics that will be presented. And so folks have an expectation that they will learn more about those things. So those are core topics. And how it's presented and when it's presented depends on who's in the room and how they show up.
Okay.
And that's pretty obvious to the facilitators as we go forward.
Okay. You mentioned diversity, and that was something that was one of the topics in the community learning sessions. And the way it was presented and the room it had in the lab, that was unique for me based on what I've experienced before. How do you introduce it, and what is it about the diversity topic? Is it a US development?
Yeah, diversity is introduced at the opening session as we're getting started, and it's announced as a thread that will exist throughout the week. We have found in the past that when diversity was a topic that was going to be discussed on Wednesday.
So the third day, Wednesday would be the third day, more or less.
Would be the third day.
Yeah.
People would often just hold their breath and grit their teeth and try to get through it and not really learn or address it. And what we found out over time is that participants represent many different social identity groups. Examples would be race, gender, sexual identity, religion, mental and physical capacity, and class. And that's just a few of the social identity groups that are present. Recognition of these differences and how people choose to address them is important. And so every participant has a right to be in the room and to feel safe about expressing who they are and being respected. And so for that reason, diversity, equity, and inclusion are addressed during every session in some manner. So that's been a part of the lab for at least 45 years that I've been exposed to NTL. First as a participant that was sent to NTL to buff up some of my rough edges that I had as an engineer, and then for the last 27 years as a member. So it's important to let people know that all social identity groups are represented and respected, and we will just sort of deal with that and weave that into every conversation around communications, self-identity, group dynamics, and how that plays out in the lab, as well as how they would take that back home.
I was just, when you mentioned you were sent to a lab to make it a bit smoother, so to speak, I was wondering, is it possible if someone is being sent to a lab, but you basically answered it by being here, because obviously it was very successful in your case. But is it common that people join a lab because they're sent by their employers to attend?
It is. That does happen. And it shows up as performance issues on the job. And maybe it's how they interact with people. They may have excellent technical skills, but have very poor relationship or people skills. And many people in organizations want to rise in an organization. And what happens as people go higher in an organization, there's less dependence on their technical skills, but more on their ability to relate to people, have develop relationships, and get things done at a higher level. So oftentimes people are sent to improve those human relation skills, hence the name Human Interaction Lab. And one of the things that I have done as a facilitator is to help a person realize that your job is not at risk. They think that they're about to get fired if they don't, quote, do well in the Human Interaction Lab. And that's not what it's about. The company is paying them. They paid for them to come to the lab. They are invested in their improvement. And once I have that conversation with people, they tend to relax and go, oh, I'm not being punished by being here, but I'm really here to enhance skills, to learn skills, to improve skills that I did not have, or that will be important in my future with my company or my organization.
So that explains a lot around diversity and how people show up in the lab. And I found myself, when I introduced the diversity topics a couple of minutes ago, how I was stumbling over the topic. And that was interesting for me because diversity was one of the topics where I learned the most, I would say, in the lab. That was absolutely amazing for me. And realizing how I'm stumbling when I think about a certain topic, that would be the unconscious for me. Contrary to the lab, where I experienced talking about the visible behavior. And you talked about it a little bit in the beginning, what visible behavior would be. So if there is an interaction between two individuals. So I found that very interesting, to focus on the visible behavior and not on the unconscious. Why is it that there is such a strong focus on the visible behavior and not the unconscious? And I'm asking because I know the unconscious is discussed a lot at Tavistock, for example, where I learned to focus on the unconscious. So that was kind of the opposite for me.
Sure. I can see physical behavior.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thinking is. I don't know what your belief system is.
Yeah.
But if a person is crying in the T group, that's a cue for me to just ask them, what are the tears about? And it's up to them to go wherever they choose to go with that. A person may leave the room. They may just sort of get up and leave the room. That's something that's not normally done, because we have breaks and allow people time to stretch their legs. And I'm not talking about, say, just sort of bathroom breaks if you need to take care of yourself. If a person is, let's say their face turns red, that's another visible cue for me to try to sense what is going on with them, because blood is rising up on their face and something is causing that to happen because it wasn't that way an hour ago. Something has shifted. So I'm paying attention to what's going on in the group. We talked earlier about people sitting in a circle. If a person physically moves their chair out of the circle, and it's not violent, it could be subtle, but they're clearly out of the circle, that's a cue for me. And I would ask them, what's going on, or how are they feeling about what's being discussed, and engage them to share what's going on with them. And it's up to them to give me information that would reveal their unconscious.
So that would be talking about the person, what is going on with the person in the moment. So what is, maybe something is happening in the group and it has a certain impact. That was one word that came up for me regularly. So there is an impact that something has on me and I'm retreating from the group. And what kind of other, let's say, interventions do you do? So what are you focusing on? You are looking at an individual. So what's happening with the individual person, like the blood is rising. And you described looking at the interaction of two people. And the third one is the group level, so that you're looking at the group. Can you give us an example for the group level behavior?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. A group level intervention is a question or a statement that's intended to move the group. This can happen after an extended amount of silence or even chatter about the latest athletic event. And so that's a group behavior that I could recognize. And I think that dialogue about the experience that occurs in the group will engage the participants more than a story about something that happened a long time ago or the latest athletic event, which is outside of the bounds of the T group. So that's, once I recognize that, I might ask the group what the silence is about, or ask them to really talk about something that is happening in the here and now that the group has experienced. And that would be an intervention that would move the group.
So these type of interventions, they can be made by members of the group and they can be made by the staff.
Yes.
And you as a staff, I find it interesting to see different people, and during the TTTG, there were 3 of you. And during another HI lab, I realized that certain staff members behave differently. So some are more passive, some are more active. Some are kind of a skilled participant, so they are very active and feel like a member of, as if they're a member of the group, or a peer as if they're a member of the group. Why are people behaving differently in the staff role?
Sure. The staff are as different as the participants in terms of how they approach the work.
Yeah.
The goal is the same. The goal of the staff is to help the group grow.
Yeah.
And so the facilitator styles vary from being very hands-off to being very engaged in the group. I favor allowing the group to find its way from the beginning or during the forming stages of the group. I tend to become more active or provide more interventions as the group grows.
Mm-hmm.
This reduces the group's dependency on me for leadership, direction, or agenda setting.
Mm-hmm.
And this is stated prior to the start of the T group, that you would witness the facilitators differently than you do in the community session.
Yeah.
And I think that the group is more actively engaged based on what's happening in the group.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I would facilitate in a way. That's a bit about style. Yeah.
And I find that very intriguing. In the beginning, you said that you're creating a vacuum because there doesn't seem to be a task. And I mean, there is a task to observe and analyze the behavior of the small group. But I found that interesting. And I was grappling a lot with the staff as an authority. And I was annoyed when the staff wouldn't react and behave like I would hope that or expect an authority to behave. So that was a very challenging thing for me. And you talked about emotions as well, like people tearing up. That seems to be not uncommon in the lab. What about these emotions, if they come up? I experience it as very warm in a way, but also very stressful. In which way do these strong emotions support the learning?
I would say that the emotions support the learning because it's an indicator, a physical indicator of what's real for people. There are people that will try to numb themselves or to deny or suppress their feelings or their emotions. And if they're willing to allow those feelings come forward, they'll recognize what's important. And I think that's an indication, whether it's tears, whether it's anger, whether it is withdrawal, whatever the feelings are, it's important to acknowledge them and give them a place to speak because it's part of people's behavior. And that's where the learning occurs. If you can listen to your feelings don't lie. It's an indication of, do you feel warm? Are you attracted to a point of view or a person, or are you repelled by someone? And that's an opportunity for you to look at the reasons that you feel the way that you do.
And if I get back into the real world, so if I leave the lab after the week, I felt very sensitive. And I remember there was one recommendation not to overwhelm the rest of the world with what you have learned at the moment. Right. So what might change when people get back, and what is important for them from your point of view if they're getting back?
Some things that could change once they go back is that they have the confidence to challenge certain behaviors where they were silent in the past. Other changes may be that you listen more to people where your default behavior might be to dictate or to tell people what to do. Those are some changes that might occur when you get back. It's important to allow yourself time to let things sink in. So I would suggest that people not try to go back and share everything that they have learned, because the impact is people want to be helpful. And say someone has come out of the desert and they are thirsty. Do you give them water out of a fire hose, or do you give them water out of a garden hose?
No.
And so what is it that they would be able to receive that would help them?
Yeah.
And I think those are things that people or participants need to recognize in themselves, to allow questions to come, to ask them, what did you learn? Or I've observed that you're a different person. What did you experience that caused you to be different than you were a month ago or 3 months ago?
When you say a different person, I immediately got scared and thought, okay, if I'm going into a lab, I will be not the same anymore.
Well, you are certainly having an experience that will change you. But if you think about your loved ones or people that you have worked with, they have not changed since you've been away. So just recognize that you are the person that has changed, and not come back with a series of demands because you learned something about giving and receiving feedback, that you are going to force this on some other people. I would say, let your experience soak in, and let your attention and questions be, how was your week? And what's been going on since I've been away? What have you been doing? And see how you can integrate yourself back into their lives.
And for me, it took quite a long time to let things sink in. Do people return after a certain while? Is it possible to do a second lab, or is it like you're waiting a year and then you're like you have fully digested it?
People have returned to labs. I think that a year is a reasonable amount of time before you go through the experience again, because you want to allow what you learned to become a part of you. And it gets to a point where it's part of your unconscious, that you're behaving in new ways. But absolutely, people will do the same lab again, because you are a new person, you're a year older. Sometimes people will want to do a different lab, which NTL offers more advanced labs, and learn a different skill set or practice in a different way. So yes, people can repeat it, but I would offer, take a break and let it sink in over, let's say, a year before you do another lab.
All right. Sounds like I have a lot to let sink in. Thank you very much, Bob. That was very interesting.
Thank you, Jürgen. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and I hope that your colleagues and students find it useful, and would love for them to come and attend NTL Human Interaction Lab. It will be a positive, wonderful experience for them, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to your questions and let me know, how it turns out and what comments you hear from your listening audience.
Thank you very much for staying with us for the last 60 minutes. And I hope you got quite some insights about how the NTL HI Lab is designed and whether that might be something that would support your learning, or it doesn't at that point in time. Nevertheless, thank you very much for listening to the Group Dynamic podcast and this interesting episode. And I would be grateful if you subscribe or recommend the podcast to anyone you might think it would add value to. Hear you next time.